Hello everyone, my name is Mansa and welcome back to my channel. Today we have another video on Advanced Wars by Web, but instead of doing a replay analysis, we're going to be discussing a tier list today of all 25 units in Advanced Wars by Web. This video will focus primarily on each unit's relevance in standard play. I may do another video later on discussing both fog and high funds relevance for all the units, but just for now we'll be discussing each unit's relevance in standard. Talking about the tiers, we have the standard setup of S, A, B, C, and D tier for all the units. In addition, we have the trash tier, which will become self-evident for the units in there, and the banned tier. This tier will be mainly just for units that are banned in most maps. The Black Bomb is going to be a strong candidate for this tier, but there may be a few others in there as well as we go on. Before we start going through each unit, just a formatting note here. I won't actually be discussing the various stats of the units when I'm doing the breakdown, unless it comes up and it's at a natural point. Instead, what I'm going to be doing is showing a stat sheet for each unit as I talk about them at the start of the discussion. That way you can read everything and learn anything you need to know about each of the units if you don't know it already. The tier list itself is going to be more discussing the various strategies and roles these units play, rather than any of their individual stats. So that's kind of just the formatting I'm going to use here. But with all that out of the way, though, let's hop right into the tier list and discuss each of these units' relevance in standard play on Advanced Wars by Web. Starting with the infantry unit, the infantry unit is a easy S tier. Infantry units are arguably the strongest units in the game. There's multiple points going for them. One, they're the cheapest units in the game, costing only 1,000 gold to produce. They are the heart of your early game, allowing you to capture cities, a power that only infantry and mechs have, which ultimately build up your income, allowing you to purchase other units in the game. They are the soul and foundation upon which you build your entire game, and thus they're incredibly important in both the early game and the mid game to capture all of the cities on the map. Infantry don't just become worthless, though, in the end game. In the end game, most matches on Advanced Wars by Web, you have your various win conditions of HQ capture, routing, capture limit, time limit on certain maps. But really, what it comes down to in most Advanced Wars by Web's games is your opponent resigning. 90 to 95% of matches in Advanced Wars by Web will end in a resign by your opponent. Even higher than that at various high-level matches. This means you need to get your opponent to resign, and there's really a few different ways that you can do that. One, have an overwhelming army compared to your opponent, so either a much higher unit count or unit value. Or two, and this is where the infantry come in, have an overwhelming income advantage over your opponent. On certain maps, especially low fund maps where there's not a lot of cities on the map, having a 3 to 4k income advantage over your opponent is basically a win condition, and most people will resign at that point. So infantry are not only incredibly important in the early to mid game, they are also incredibly important in the late game to push for an income advantage alongside your army to ultimately lead to a resign, and thus they're a win condition in the end game. In addition to this, besides all the functionality that infantry serve for an income perspective, they also make great walling tools. That is the other main use of infantry. In standard play especially, infantry walls are the most common tactic that you will see, especially on maps like Page Avenue or some of these other kind of stallier centered maps. You will see just massive lines of infantry going up and down the entire map that protect all your units while keeping your own units in range to attack your opponent. So they have incredible versatility. You should always be building them. You should never, ever, ever be base skipping in Advanced Wars by Web, unless you're super high level or it really is a needed unit at that time. And the reason why you should never be base skipping as a general rule is because infantry are so powerful and they're so versatile throughout all stages of the game. Moving now to the Mech. The Mech is a C tier unit. I don't think the Mech is that great for a few different reasons, but before I start shitting on the Mech, I think I should give it its props and talk about some of the COs that really utilize Mechs to the best. Obviously, Sammy with her powers that give the Mechs extra firepower and extra move. Sammy's mechs are incredibly good. Adder, the same way, getting extra movement on the mechs makes them incredibly strong. And mechs as a general role they kind of serve as a zoning tool. They're kind of like a mini artillery in a way because they protect your other infantry from getting attacked by having a deterrence effect that if you attack the infantry within the range of the mech can come in and do significant damage to that tank, and it will win kind of this income trade-off between mech and tank. So in that way, they're kind of like a cheaper artillery. The problem is mechs are much less mobile than the artillery. The artillery have 5 movement on treads, while the mech only has 2. So you have to be very careful with mechs. They can be very strong in certain maps, like Last Vigil, Page Avenue. They're pretty good going across the mountains. Really, any situation where you have a mountainous terrain that is the cutoff point between two fronts, mechs can be good. But as a general rule, you don't want to be spamming them. If you're going for mechs, you can start to build a slight mech chain, maybe 2-3 mechs to really maximize their power. But they're really a unit you buy because your income is at weird numbers, right? If you had more income, you would want to be buying a tank. If you have less income, just buy infantry. And that's what it really comes down to, I feel like. If you have 3 or 4K and you think, oh, I'll just buy a mech because I can afford it, that's actually a bad play. You should be buying the infantry because you never know when you need that little bit of extra funds later on in the game to respond to a unit your opponent builds, right? If they build a Neot tank and you're sitting there with 21K and 3 bases they need to buy, having that extra 3K from the 3K from the mech could help you with some of your buys, right? Maybe not even necessarily getting a Neot tank of your own, but helping to get a medium tank and, medium tank infantry could be a build that you could have in that scenario by saving that extra 3K. So mechs can be strong. They have use cases. They're not completely worthless unit, but they're definitely weak in Advanced Wars by Web, especially in standard play. They can have a bit more viability as kind of a sneak unit or a trap unit in Fog, but I don't rank them very highly. I think they're a C tier unit. Moving on to the Recon. The Recon is a top of C tier unit in standard play. You might think that the Recon is pretty much worthless in standard play because the main aspect of it, the vision bonuses, don't really matter, and it's mainly a Fog unit. And while that's true to a case, and it's not a high tier unit in standard play, the Recon definitely still has advantages. The most primary reason that Recons can be viable in standard play is early aggression, right? I remember I played a game against Degis on a Hope Forlorn where he sent like 2 different Recons both in the north and the south of that map, just relentlessly attacking my infantry as I was trying to cap. And because of this, and because tanks are a bit slower on that map and you don't want to necessarily commit to a tank on the weak side, he was able to get a significant income advantage over me and ultimately win that game very quickly over me. So Recons can serve a great early aggression tool in standard play. That being said, though, they really fall off in the mid game, right? Once you get a bunch of tanks on the field, and some of these other more traditional vehicles, even something like an AntiAir can bully a Recon pretty hard. Recons really fall off in their usefulness. You'll see it built in the end game a bit, but generally as kind of a win more mechanic. People who are already up a significant amount will build a Recon normally on their weak side to deal with the infantry that their opponent is spamming out from their 2 base. But it's kind of win more in that way. You're never going to be building a Recon when you're down because you need to be building tanks and other units to try to catch up. So it can be a great tool in the early game of standard matches, but I really don't see much viability past that. And obviously, since it can't give its vision bonuses in standard, it's just not as strong of a unit. And I think it's not worthless. It's not trash. It definitely has purposes, even more than necessarily like the mech. But it is just not a great unit in standard, so it's a C tier unit. Moving now to the first of the transport units, we have the APC. And the APC is a D tier unit in standard play. I think transports in general can be very good units, and they definitely have some viability on certain maps in standard. You think of something like Cycle Stay Guyana, where you need to build the T-copter to get to that island. But in standard, they're just not as good. And that's because your opponent can see that you've gone for a transport, right? In Fog, it's much more of a viable option because your opponent could think that you're going for an early aggression play with recons or saving up for a tank, and thus that allows you to be greedy and go for transport openings where you get a bunch of contested properties really quick. But in standard, as soon as they see you build that APC or build that T-copter, they're just going to go aggressive on you. They're going to build tanks. They may even get out recons, and they're just going to fight any aggression that you have going towards contested properties. And it's for this reason that I don't think the APC is that strong in standard. The one saving grace for the APC is that it is a needed unit to support a stealth. And we'll go into the viability of the stealth a little bit later. It's a very polarizing unit. But if you buy a stealth ever on a map, you're definitely going to need an APC because it is going to run out of fuel, and that's the only way that you can save it. So if you are getting a stealth, the APC is kind of necessary, but just as purely as a transport tool, the APC is weak, especially for the 5k cost, right? I mean, that's 1k away from an artillery, which is a definitively better unit in standard play. So I think it deserves its spot in D tier. Moving now to the unit that we all think we are great at utilizing, but truly are not. It is the artillery. And the artillery is A tier unit in standard play. Obviously, if you are one of the greats of the website, someone like Inkugark or some of these artillery masters, the artillery is an easy S tier unit. But for the majority of us in the normal world, artillery are not as strong as you may think they are. And that's just because that in standard play, tanks are the bread and butter. There's going to be, at any time in the mid game, 7, 8, 9 tanks on the field. And if any of those tanks reach your artillery, it's done, right? You don't have any usefulness left in that artillery. And it's for this reason that artillery kind of serve as a zoning tool more than an attacking tool, right? If you listen to various videos, you may find this term of the economy of units, right? Like how much damage is your unit doing? Is it earning itself in? Is it, plus, minus, what is the value of that unit? And you can't really think that way for an artillery because a good artillery may not ever shoot at a unit, right? It could just zone out parts of the maps, allowing you to capture contested cities or allowing for a city flip in certain areas, or even protecting valuable units like a tank or a battlecopter or an anti-air. Especially so, by the way, if you double up your artillery. So double artillery, each one supporting each other, can be a very strong zoning and walling tool in standard play. But the main issue with the artillery is kind of the mental game aspect of the artillery and the constant need for defense. If your artillery is ever attacked and it takes, even one hit from a tank, it's going to be down to 3 or 4 HP, and it's going to be out of service for multiple turns if you choose to heal it, if not dead entirely. And in those cases, if you have no recourse for that attack, that is a huge loss, and you're losing a lot of tempo by missing out on this artillery, right? And that's why they're not as good as tanks, right? Because tanks can give that counterattack back and at least do some damage to your opponent, but your artillery is very literally a sitting duck. So if you're choosing to invest in artillery, you have to protect it at all times, which can be very taxing because if you have to figure out your opponent's powers and various units and sacrifices and all this stuff, it's a lot to consider to try to keep your artillery alive, especially when you want the artillery on the front line to zone to do its job, right? So it can be a very challenging aspect of it, and why if you don't have perfect play, it slips down to an A tier, maybe even a B tier unit, as opposed to someone at the top of the top who knows how to wall, who knows how to effectively use artillery. For them, it's more of a S tier unit than for the standard player. The last aspect of the artillery that I kind of alluded to earlier is that it can be good as actually a bait unit. And what do I mean by this? If you put an artillery in a position that your opponent can attack it, but it would leave them way overextended, it can be a useful tool in that manner because people, especially in kind of the mid tier of Advanced Wars by Web, they see an artillery and they see red, right? They want to go in, they want to attack it, they want to kill it because they know the value of that and that it can give them a huge lead if there is no counterattack. But people don't ever actually calculate that counterattack in these kind of mid-tier ranks. They just go in no matter how much they're overextending just to get that artillery. And when that happens, you can absolutely punish them and do more damage than the artillery was worth. And in this way, it can become a very successful bait, a little lure for your opponent to come in. So that's a kind of a tertiary use of artillery, not necessarily a main use, but it does have value in that way, and it's not something that should be overlooked. Overall, though, for these reasons, the artillery sits in A tier, higher if you're a more skilled player, and honestly lower if you're lesser skilled. So know yourself, know your skill level. That will determine how many artillery you want to buy in a match. Final point for the artillery, just remember this as we're about to move on to the tanks. If you're playing Jake, artillery goes up to S tier as well because his powers obviously extend the range of the artillery, making them much stronger than they are normally. Moving now to the tank, and the tank, I won't waste anyone's time, is an S tier unit. It is arguably the strongest unit in the game. That discussion will go between the infantry and the tank. But if it's not the strongest unit in the game, it is the second strongest unit in the game. And the tank is absolutely amazing for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's only 7k, so it's very cheap compared to some of the other units on this list that we will talk about. It has great movement, 6 movement, and on treads, which is a very good movement type. It's not going to get slowed down by map terrain. And it can attack almost any other unit, making it very versatile. It has good matchups against infantry, mechs if it gets the first strike, recons, anti-air, artillery, other tanks. Every unit on this list so far, the tank has a great matchup against. And even some on the list that we haven't talked about, like rockets, anti-air, missiles, some of these other units. It is for this reason that tanks are an incredibly cost-effective buy, right? You want to be spamming tanks in your matches, having a tank advantage over your opponent, because if you do, you will most likely win most of your games. You look at someone like, I believe it was Tordred, who came up, through the higher ranks of Advanced Wars by Web, and he was just known as a tank spammer for like a lot of his rise up before, people realized just how good of a player he is. I'm not dissing Tordred, he's an amazing player. But that was a legitimate strategy to reach the upper echelon of Advanced Wars by Web players for a time, just because people weren't realizing just how overpowered this unit is. Like, you literally just have 3 or 4 or 5 more tanks than your opponent and you win. You just have the ability to trade units better, control cities better, get late game flips by controlling those spaces and allowing your infantry to come in. They're just an amazing unit. And especially in standard, where you don't have to worry about building recons or some of these other units, you should be building as many tanks as possible and only be taking up to these other units like mediums or neos as it is necessary in the match, kind of near the mid to late part of the games. But for the most part, the main attacking units in your army will be tanks, and thus they're an S tier unit. Moving now to the anti-air. The anti-air are also an S tier unit. They're not as good necessarily as the tanks or the infantry, but they are an incredibly strong unit in their own right. In Advanced Wars by Web, we talk about triangle units a lot, and those triangle units are tanks, anti-airs, and battlecopters. And the reason they're called the triangle is because, number one, these are the 3 units you want to be buying the most of in your games, and number 2, these are the units that kind of have a rock, paper, scissors matchup, right? Tanks counter anti-air, anti-air will counter battlecopters, and battlecopters can counter tanks. But anti-airs fulfill their part of the triangle kind of in a different way from the other two, in that they absolutely dominate battlecopters, right? They can one-shot battlecopters, right? Where tanks can't one-shot anti-air and battlecopters can't one-shot tanks. So because of this, they have a much stronger part of their matchup, and they can even do so at low HP, right? A 5 HP battlecopter, a 5 HP anti-air can take down a full HP battlecopter just because of how oppressive their attack power is against that unit. In addition, besides just having an incredibly favorable matchup against all air units, anti-airs also have an insanely good matchup against infantry and mech units. This makes them a great tool for interrupting caps and, importantly, wall breaking. Anti-airs can actually be an incredibly scary unit in the mid part of the game, because if you see an enemy anti-air coming and it can wall break one of your infantry on a plane that allows his tanks to come in and start devastating your army, that is a real threat. You need to back up or put in other units that can wall off more effectively than your infantry, because that anti-air can be devastating. And when you do that move, when you pull in your anti-air to wall break, you can put in tanks in front of it, ensuring that the anti-air will survive too. So it's really a zero risk type of move to make that kind of attack. And it's for this reason the anti-air has incredible utility outside of the air combat space as well. The last important reason anti-air are so good is because they can do severe damage to bombers, maybe even in some cases one-shot them depending on your CO. This is an incredibly valuable tool as bombers are almost 3 times, if not, I think they're over 3 times as expensive as an anti-air, and you'll see them in late games as a counter to your own Neot tanks. So this becomes an incredibly important protective tool as well, not just protecting your normal tanks from battlecopters, but also your medium and Neot tanks from bombers. It's for this reason that you'll be wanting to build a surplus of anti-air in most of your matches. And you see this especially in high level play where people spam battlecopters a lot. Go to any of the top 5 players' matches on some of their various maps, and you will just see a glut of both battlecopters and anti-air to fight off one another, because that is how you build high unit count and also to counter your opponent's own attempts to build that unit count as well. It is for all these reasons that anti-air, despite not being as good as tanks, are still an S tier unit in standard play. Moving now to the missile units. The missiles are trash. They're horrible. There's not much to say about the missiles other than that the anti-air does the job of the missiles, but better in literally every single way. And the reason for that is because of the movement of the missiles. As you can see in the pop-up that I'm showing on screen, missiles only have 4 movement and they're on tires, which means they can basically go nowhere, right? The first forest that a missile runs into, and it's like dead halted. It can only go into the forest. That's the only thing you can do. And when you have the minimum range that the missiles have, it doesn't serve as an effective deterrent tool at all, right? A battlecopter can come into that minimum range because it has better mobility than the missiles and completely wipe it out. It's horrible, right? And the battlecopter can't do that against anti-air, right? Because if it tries to take that engagement, it's only going to do 2-3 damage to the anti-air, and the anti-air is going to shoot it down. So there's no reason to ever build missiles unless you're going for an airport lock across a body of water or somewhere where the missiles can't be attacked. That's literally like the only use case for missiles ever. But in an actual air combat where you're going to be directly fighting your opponent 1v1, they're absolutely worthless. Never build them. They're also 4K more expensive for the anti-air despite being significantly worse. They're an absolute noob trap. They're trash. Do not build them. The last thing I will say about the missiles as kind of a respect thing or a culture of Advanced Wars by Web is that you will see them build in a fair amount of maps actually as a resign tool. People treat it as a meme that the turn right before you're going to resign, most people will build the missiles and then immediately resign. And if that is not an indictment about how bad this unit is in general, that people want to build it as a joke right before they resign, I don't know what else I can say about it. It deserves its spot in trash tier. Moving to the rockets. Rockets are a low B tier unit in standard play. And I really struggle to rank the rockets for the same reason that I struggle to rank the artillery, in that it massively depends on the skill level of the user. As I kind of show the stats here, I'll also show this meme I created as well, kind of describing how I feel rockets are utilized, right? In very low level play, people think they're absolutely OP because they have this amazing range and can attack units without being attacked themselves. But they don't realize that the horrible mobility and the fact that rockets are on tires of the rockets make them absolutely useless, especially if you're trying to front switch away to match your opponent if they're moving to another side of the map. And that's generally the way you deal with, indirect spammers in general, right? You just front switch, you move away from their units, you attack where they're weak, and they don't have a counter for that. But you will see rockets utilized in the very top level play of Advanced Wars players as well. So you have to ask yourself why. Why is a unit that most people in the mid-level of Advanced Wars by Web agree are horrible and a bad use of money, why is it being built at the top level? And the answer for that is that in top level play, most games will devolve in kind of to this stally, wally scenario that I've talked about in previous videos, specifically in standard play. And when this happens, a rocket can be an amazing tool, both for slowly to start to slightly inch forward, exuding a zone of control, pushing your opponent's units away from the cities that you want to capture, and also as a base lock tool, right? You get slow position through these pushes with your indirect units to an advantageous position where you can start to move your rocket to a position where you can potentially base lock your opponent. And if you get this base lock off, you've basically won the game. So the rockets, just like the infantry that we talked about at the beginning of this video, become a win condition at certain times. If you can get a base lock off, if you can control vital property like maybe a comm tower or something else, you can start to win a somewhat an unwinnable game when you see this kind of wall scenario. And it's for this reason that rockets at high level play are an A to S tier unit. Probably not, I would say A at most, just because they are very expensive, and if you lose them, it's even worse than losing an artillery, right? It's 15k as opposed to 6. But in mid-level play and in low-level play, rockets are honestly a C tier unit, if not even, if you're utilizing them horribly, a D tier unit. But averaging it all out and considering that they can be good if you're using them correctly, I will slot them into a B tier unit in standard play. Moving now to the medium tank. The medium tank is an A tier unit in standard play. It is very expensive. It's 16k as compared to a normal tank's 7k, and it does have one less movement, which may not sound like a lot, but definitely you will feel in your matches. But the advantages of the medium tank is it can be an absolutely devastating tool that you can throw into your opponent's pushes, right? If your opponent is ever getting way too aggressive with tanks and a few anti-airs trying to really bully you in a spot and making sure that your battlecopters can't come in and defend, a medium tank is the natural counter to all of this. A well-timed medium tank can absolutely halt the push of your opponents and allow you to recover. And it's for this reason it's an amazing defensive tool, right? You don't necessarily want to be pushing in deep with your medium tanks. You want to be building them as a defensive reaction to your opponents. And they serve this role very well. The only way to really counter a medium tank is a medium tank of your own or a Neot tank, both of which are very expensive units that if you're not prepared, you probably won't have the funds or have built them early on enough to counter a medium tank build by your opponent. Overall, though, despite their cost of 16k, medium tanks are a strong unit. Like I said, they're more defensive than offensive, but they can serve the role very well. It's for this reason that they're an easy A tier unit. They're a tank, but bigger, right? More powerful, still better. If the tank's S tier, the medium tank is easy A tier. Moving now to the Pipe Runner. The Pipe Runner is trash tier. Do not build the Pipe Runner. Just like I said, do not build the Missles, do not build the Pipe Runner. Pipe Runner is way too expensive, 20k, and on most maps, you will not have any pipes to use it on, so if you build it, you're just base locking yourself and immediately losing the game. It is like the Missles, a meme tier unit people will build right before they resign, but it just really serves no purposes on most maps. On maps where there actually is a pipe seams and a pipe track to actually utilize the Pipe Runner, they're honestly not horrible. You wouldn't ever want to build like more than one, but the large range of the Pipe Runner and the fact that it can attack both land and air units, which most people do not know, makes them a unit that you could maybe build once in certain maps, but on the vast majority of standard maps, especially because there are no pipe networks like the ones I'm talking about on 99% of maps, they're just completely trash and only built as a resign tool to basically say, GG's, building a Pipe Runner, and I'm leaving. They're trash. Moving now to the Neot tank. The Neot tank is an S tier unit. It is a tricky unit to utilize in most of your matches just because it is so expensive, right? It's 22k, but it is absolutely a weapon if you can find yourself the ability to afford it. It is the ultimate attacking tool. If the medium tank is the defensive tool, the Neot tank is the attacking tool. It has amazing matchups against basically every unit in the game. It only really gets hard countered by a mega tank or a bomber, which are both incredibly expensive units that your opponents would have to build. And it's also incredibly fast, right? It has the same movement of the tank. So it's just a tank, but better. And you have to ask yourself, is something that costs 3 times the tank 3 times better? Well, yeah, right? Because if you're getting bullied by a medium tank or copters in the area that are really choking off an area that you want to attack, a Neot tank doesn't really care about any of that, right? The copters will start to slowly bite away at the Neot tank and do 1 HP, 2 HP slowly. But even then, it's not, one battle copter is not going to be an effective counter against a Neot tank. So they're the ultimate pushing tool. You'll see them a lot in the mid to late game. It can absolutely win you a position by building one in certain spots, and it can also be an effective defensive tool, just like the medium tank. If you need it to be in that role because your opponent, let's say, is building a Neo tank of their own coming at you, the Neo tank is also an amazing defensive tool. It is incredibly versatile and just great all around. The only reason why it's not as good as the anti-air tank or infantry is just because it's way too expensive, right? It's 22k. You're not going to see it in the middle game. You're not going to see it in the early game. You should never like save up for a Neo tank. Like, I'm not going to build 3 early game tanks. I'm going to save up for a Neo tank and I'll beat my opponent. That's not going to work. They're going to get different, map position over you. While you're saving for your Neo tank, and they're going to get an income advantage and win. So don't do that. Don't think you're like outsmarting your opponent that way. But this strategy of Neo tanks in the mid to late game as an offensive push is very strong, and it's for that reason that they're an S tier unit. Quickly before we move on as well, I'll just say that they are the bread and butter unit in high funds, right? Tanks are to standard as Neo tanks are to high funds. They're the top of S tier in high funds. But yeah, like I said, we may get to that video later. But for now in standard, they're still an S tier unit. Moving now to the Mega Tank, and as you can see, I've added a tier to this tier list, and that is because the Mega Tank is an amazing unit, right? It's super powerful. It can destroy every other unit on the map. It has low movement, but other than that, it's an amazing unit. But you're too broke. You'll never be able to afford it in standard play. It is, I think, 28,000, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly, for a single unit. Most maps have that. Like the highest of income maps will have like 25, 26k total in income parity. And like I said earlier, you never want to base skip, right? So if you're trying to not base skip and buy a mega tank, you need like 30,000 funds. Like, you're just never going to get that. It's for this reason that you basically never see a mega tank in standard play. I will say it is the ultimate hold on unit that people build, right? Let's say in mixed space scenarios, on a mixed space map. People will sometimes, not advisable, but will sometimes build a mega tank in standard to hold on to a base because it's basically impossible to remove it unless you're building, bringing in a bomber or rockets or some very heavy tanks of your own. Even an artillery won't take down a mega tank on a city or on a base. But I don't think this is an effective strategy, right? Because what are you attacking, right? They're going to be walling off that mega tank with infantry, so you're killing a 1k unit per turn and holding onto a base for like 3, maybe 4 turns before they can remove it. Like, is that worth 28k in the position? Like, maybe at sometimes, but you're investing so much into something that will ultimately die, and you'll never actually see this unit being utilized in any type of an offensive fashion because, like I said, 4 movement is horrible. It's not going to be able to do anything with that. It can be a good unit at times, and in high funds, you'll see a lot of mega tanks. They are kind of the Neo tank of high funds, if you will, in that it's the trump card in certain cases. But in standard play, you're too broke. You'll never see it. And if you do see it, if you are building it, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong for your bases. Before we get into the air units, I think I'm going to make the call here to make this a 2-part video. I think this video is going to get just a bit too long if I cover every single unit in the game for our standard play. So part 2 of this video, we will cover both air units and naval units in Advanced Wars by Web. Go ahead and take a screenshot of these units if you want a tier list for your standard games. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Mansa Musa, and remember, if you want to buy a mega tank, you gotta use Daddy's credit card. Bye, guys.